The fire crackles in the hearth. Shadows dance on ancient walls. Another Roman night settles around us, and tonight we return to the beginning, though not quite the very beginning. Welcome back. Or if you're just joining us, welcome to Rome at its most precarious moment. The moment after the founding, the moment after the first blood. Remus is dead, killed by his twin brother over a wall that barely deserved the name. The auguries have been read, the boundaries marked, the sacred rituals performed, and now Romulus stands alone on the Palatine Hill, the sole king of a city that consists of himself, some shepherds, and a wall stained with his brother's blood. This is where tonight's story begins. Not with the she-wolf or the floating basket or the dramatic childhood. We've covered that ground already in previous episodes. Tonight we pick up where fratricide left off, with a founder who has a city but no citizens, authority but no legitimacy, ambition but an extremely problematic start. Let the fire's warmth reach you. Let your shoulders drop. Let the day's concerns begin their slow recession. This is a long episode, hours of story at contemplative pace, designed for sleep, for study, for those quiet hours when you need something substantial but not demanding. Drift away if you need to. Stay alert if you prefer. The story accommodates both. Romulus has killed his brother. That's done. Can't be undone. The question now is whether you can build a city on fratricide, whether Rome can survive its violent birth, whether the founder can transform from murderer into legitimate king. Spoiler, he can. But the process is neither clean nor simple nor particularly moral by modern standards. Tonight we'll watch Romulus build Rome from almost nothing. We'll see him solve the population problem through methods that range from clever to horrifying. We'll watch him create institutions, the Senate, the army, the religious infrastructure that will outlast him by centuries. We'll see him fight wars with every neighbor, make alliances through force and strategic marriage, transform a hill settlement into something that begins to resemble a city, and we'll watch him wrestle with the weight of that first murder. The brother blood on the walls, the knowledge that Rome's foundation is violence, that its origin story is fratricide, that everything built on the Palatine Hill starts with death. Let yourself settle deeper now. Let ancient Rome rise around you, not marble and grandeur, but mud and wood and desperate ambition. The city in its infancy, vulnerable, uncertain, capable of becoming everything or nothing depending on choices made in these crucial early years. Romulus will rule for 37 years. If the traditional dates are accurate, we'll transform his brother killer's hill into a city. We'll establish the patterns and institutions that make Rome Roman. We'll do terrible things and brilliant things, and occasionally both simultaneously. And then he'll disappear, mysteriously, during a storm. Possibly murdered, possibly divine transformation. We'll get to that. But first, we need to watch him build. Watch him solve the citizen problem, and the woman problem, and the neighbor problem, and the legitimacy problem. Watch him create something real and lasting from the most unpromising of beginnings. The fire burns bright, the night is long, the story waits. Romulus stands on his hill, alone with his crime and his ambition. Rome is just an idea, a wall, a murdered brother, and the stubborn certainty that this hill will become something important. He's right, of course. It will become the center of the world, the eternal city, the foundation of empire. But tonight it's just one man, some shepherds, and the complicated question of how you build civilization when you've started by killing your twin. Let's find out. Rome waits to be built. From blood and ambition, and the particular ruthlessness required to transform violence into legitimacy. His story continues now. After the fratricide, after the founding, after the point of no return. Let's begin. Six months had passed since Remus died, and Rome had learned the art of pretending. Not forgetting. Forgetting would have been mercy, and mercy was in short supply. But proceeding anyway. The way rivers proceed over stones they cannot move. Cities don't pause for grief. Walls don't build themselves. And life, discourteous as ever, continues whether you're ready or not. The walls were higher now. Properly higher. What had been chest height in spring was head height by summer, and twice a man tall by autumn, with crenellations that looked almost professional if you squinted and didn't ask too many questions about load-bearing mathematics. Guards stood at intervals, though stood was generous. They mostly leaned and discussed whether bread was better with or without olive oil, a theological debate that would outlast empires. The walls were magnificent. Inside them was mostly empty. That's the thing about walls, they protect what's there, but they can't create it. Rome had learned this lesson slowly, the way students learn lessons when the teacher is consequences, and the textbook is mistakes. There were people, of course. Hundreds of them. Maybe close to 1,000 if you counted generously, and included the goats someone insisted were spiritually human. But people weren't the same as population, and population wasn't the same as city. What Rome had was a collection of men who'd run away from somewhere else and decided this was far enough. Romulus stood at the wall's highest point, where the Palatine met sky, and watched his city wake. Smoke from morning fires rising in thin columns, as if the earth itself were sighing. Men emerging from shelters, some wood, some canvas, some optimism held together with rope and prayer, moving through routines that were becoming familiar. Fetch water, check sheep, argue about whose goat ate whose grain. The ordinary chaos of people learning to live next to each other without violence before breakfast, which is harder than it sounds. One man, a former farmer named Titus, had built his shelter directly in the path everyone used to reach the spring. When people complained, he'd suggested they use a different path. When Romulus pointed out there was no different path, Titus had responded that this sounded like an infrastructure problem, and he looked forward to the king solving it. The shelter remained. The path got diverted. Titus was either a genius of passive aggression or supremely oblivious, and history would never decide which. Gentle. From above it looked almost legitimate. Almost like a real city instead of an ambitious refugee camp with delusions of permanence and one very inconveniently placed shelter. Almost. The asylum had been established 3 months prior, making official what had already been practice. The Capitoline Hill, second of Rome's 7 hills to be occupied, was declared sacred to Jupiter and open to anyone seeking protection. Criminals, runaway slaves, debtors fleeing obligation, men who'd made enemies in their hometowns and needed somewhere those enemies couldn't follow. All welcome, no questions asked, just one requirement: respect the walls. The proclamation ceremony had been briefer than priests preferred. Romulus had stood at the Capitoline summit with 3 priests, 1 genuine, 2 improvising enthusiastically, and poured wine on the ground. Jupiter, he'd said, this is yours. Anyone who reaches this hill is under your protection, also mine. Try not to make me regret this. Jupiter hadn't struck him dead, so the god either approved or was busy with more important matters. Gods, in Romulus's limited experience, saved their objections for truly significant occasions, like who saw more birds during auguries, or whether brothers should kill each other over architectural disagreements. After the ceremony, people came. Not floods. Rome wasn't that appealing yet, but steady trickles, the way water finds cracks. They arrived dusty and nervous, carrying what could be carried, and leaving behind what couldn't. Houses, altars, reputations, the person they'd been before, whatever happened that made them flee. The best asylum seeker and history would agree on this. Though history rarely agrees on anything, was a man named Lucius who claimed he was fleeing aggressive poetry. Romulus had asked him to elaborate, because aggressive poetry sounded like something that shouldn't exist but clearly did. Lucius had explained, with the wounded dignity of a misunderstood artist, that he'd written satirical verses about his hometown's mayor. Extremely accurate satirical verses. Verses so accurate that the mayor had declared them slander and demanded Lucius's head, preferably detached from his body and displayed somewhere public as a warning to other poets with insufficient respect for authority. Friendly. Warm. Were they slanderous? Romulus had asked. Only if truth counts as slander, Lucius had replied. Which apparently it does if you're a mayor who's sensitive about his weight, his wife's infidelities, and his habit of embezzling from the grain fund. Romulus had granted him asylum immediately, and suggested he write something positive about Rome. Lucius had promised to compose an epic about Rome's founding, focusing heavily on the parts that didn't involve fratricide. So far he'd produced 3 verses, all of which rhymed Rome with home and Romulus with glorious, which didn't technically rhyme but Lucius insisted worked spiritually if you understood poetic resonance and weren't too rigid about phonetics. By midday, Romulus attempted a census. Not officially, there were no formal records yet, just scratches on wax tablets that melted in summer heat. But he walked through the settlement and counted faces the way shepherds count flocks, by watching them move and estimating based on instinct and prayer. 800 men, give or take. Maybe 50 more if you included boys old enough to hold weapons, but young enough that their voices still cracked when they tried to sound authoritative. Ages ranging from 15 to 60, though most clustered in that optimistic span between 20 and 40 when men still believed they could build something before their backs gave out or reality did. And women. 14. 13, actually, since one had died in childbirth last month, the baby too, which had felt like a particular cruelty from gods who supposedly wanted Rome to thrive. Of the remaining 13, 9 were married to men who'd brought them from previous lives. 3 were too old to bear children, but excellent at offering unsolicited advice about everything, and 1 was a Sabine woman named Cloelia, who'd arrived 2 months ago and spent most of her time waging war against Rome's cooking standards. Colossia had opinions. Many opinions. Loud opinions. She'd taken over a cooking fire one evening and produced something genuinely edible, which had earned her grudging respect and the unofficial title of Rome's first critic of culinary mediocrity. She still complained constantly about olive oil quality, bread texture, the absence of fish, and the Roman tendency to think that burning meat until it fought back counted as preparation. But at least now people complained back, which created a kind of argumentative community that felt almost like civilization. 14 women for 800 men. The mathematics weren't just bad, they were catastrophic. Extinction numbers, 1 generation and done numbers. The kind of ratio that made sense only if you were trying to build a city that would serve as a cautionary tale rather than an actual place where people lived and children played and futures happened. Late afternoon brought a new arrival. A man walking up the hill with the careful pace of someone who'd been travelling long enough that his feet had filed formal complaints with his brain. He reached the gate and stopped, waiting for acknowledgement the way refugees learn to wait, patiently, carefully, without demanding anything. Gentle, soft, Romulus received him at what was generously called the palace. The man was perhaps 40, weathered by sun and bad choices, with the look of someone who'd been handsome once before life took interest in rearranging his face through a series of poor romantic decisions. "Welcome to Rome," Romulus said. "I'm Romulus. I know who you are," the man said. "Everyone knows who you are. The fratricide king who built a city for people nobody else wants." Most people had the decency to not mention Remus directly. This one apparently had spent his tact budget on other things. Romulus felt anger flicker, then die. What was the point? The man was right. "That's me," he said. "And you are?" "Friendly, warm Gaius. From Crustumerium originally, though I've spent the last 5 years wandering and making poor choices in various geographic locations with alarming consistency." They talked briefly. Gaius was a builder, a failed husband, a poet of dubious skill. He could construct houses and drainage ditches that actually drained. Romulus welcomed him, assigned him to work crews, sent him to find shelter. Gentle. But before leaving, Gaius paused. "King, can I ask you something?" "You can ask." "Thoughtful?" "What's the plan here? Long term? I see a lot of men building things, but—" He gestured vaguely at the settlement. "No women, no children, no future, unless I'm missing something. Are we just building a very impressive monument to temporary thinking?" It was the question Romulus asked himself every night and had no good answer for. "We're working on it," he said. "Friendly. Warm." "That's not reassuring," Gaius said. "I know," Romulus replied. "Welcome to Rome anyway." Evening found Romulus, where evening usually found him lately, on the Aventine Hill, at Remus's grave, having conversations with silence. He didn't come every day anymore. That had felt excessive after the first month, like grief performing for an audience of gods who probably weren't watching anyway. But he came often enough, weekly, roughly, whenever guilt outweighed exhaustion. The gentle, soft. The grave was simple. A mound of earth growing grass now, a stone marker with Remus's name carved in letters that were already weathering. Someone Romulus suspected Faustulus had planted wildflowers around it. They were blooming now, purple and yellow, pretty in a way that felt inappropriate for a grave, but that Remus probably would have appreciated. Romulus sat on the ground beside the marker, looking west toward sunset. This was where Remus had wanted to build, the Aventine, the hill he'd claimed with 6 vultures and temporal priority and legitimate divine favour that just happened to conflict with someone else's legitimate divine favour in ways that made brotherly cooperation difficult and eventually fatal. "I'm still building," Romulus said aloud, to the grave or the sky or the empty air that held Remus's absence like a shape cut from cloth. "In case you're wondering, the walls are higher. The city's growing. We have almost 1,000 people now." He paused. "Well, 1,000 men, barely any women. That's becoming a problem." The wind shifted, carrying the smell of evening fires and cooking food from the Palatine. Normal smells, domestic smells, The smell of people making homes instead of just shelters. Even if those people were overwhelmingly male, and their homes would die with them in one generation, unless someone figured out basic biology and civic planning. Gentle, soft. I don't know what I'm doing, Romulus admitted quietly. I thought once I had walls and laws and people, the rest would follow naturally. But it turns out cities need more than that. They need continuation. They need to exist tomorrow and the day after, and 50 years from now. And I don't know how to build that. Thoughtful, soft, solely joints protesting. 23 years old and already feeling ancient. That's what killing your brother did. Aged you in ways that had nothing to do with time. I'll figure it out, he said to the grave. I always do. Usually badly, but I figure it out. He touched the stone marker briefly. You'd have figured it out better. You were better at people. I'm just good at walls and killing relatives. He turned to leave, then paused, looking back one more time. Gentle. I'm sorry, he said. Again, for the 1000th time. I was right about the augury. Wrong about everything else. Those two things aren't compatible, but they're both true. The grave offered no response. Graves never did. That was their fundamental limitation. Excellent listeners, terrible conversationalists. Gentle boykmas, gentle backaby. Romulus passed through the growing settlement as evening turned it soft and golden. A group of men sat around a fire, singing something that was either a hymn or a drinking song. The line between the two was thinner than priests admitted. They saw Romulus and raised their wineskin in greeting. He raised his hand in return, kept walking. Kings didn't join. That was one of kingship's smaller cruelties. You were surrounded by people but couldn't actually be with them. At the palace, Achates was waiting. He'd been waiting a lot lately. That was his job now, apparently. Professional waiter. Royal guardian. The person who made sure Romulus didn't do anything too stupid without at least someone knowing about it first. Friendly. Warm. You were at the grave, Achates said. Not a question. I was at the grave, Romulus confirmed. Gentle. How is he? Still dead. Hasn't changed his position on that yet. Very stubborn about it. Achates smiled despite himself. That's Remus. Always committed to his choices, even the permanent ones. They sat on the steps and watched the settlement settle into night. Gentle. We have a problem, Achates said after a while. Just one. We're improving. The women. Or lack of women. People are noticing. People are asking. What's the plan? Romulus looked at his oldest friend, his guardian, the person who'd followed him from shepherding to kingship. I don't have one yet. That's not reassuring. I know. It's becoming my signature response. Gentle. Soft. You need to do something. Achates pressed. Rome can't survive if it's just men. We're building for nobody. One generation and we're done. I know, Romulus repeated. He'd counted the numbers, done the mathematics, stared at the catastrophic ratios until they were burned into his brain. I'm working on it. Thoughtful, I don't know yet. But probably something desperate. Possibly something terrible. Almost certainly something I'll regret. He looked at Achates directly. But something. Because you're right. Rome dies without futures. Gentle nicely didn't work, Achates observed. No, asking nicely got us laughed at, and insulting responses about fratricides not deserving daughters. Thoughtful, so what's left when asking nicely fails? Romulus didn't answer. He knew what was left. The uncivilized approaches, the improper solutions, the kind of thinking that kept you awake at night because you knew you were going to do it anyway. I'll think of something, he said finally. Achates studied his face. That's what worries me, he said quietly. That night, Romulus lay awake and thought about impossible mathematics. 800 men, 14 women, the kind of numbers that told you exactly how this story ended, and it didn't end well unless something changed dramatically. He'd sent envoys, asked nicely, offered trade agreements. Every city had said no. Rome wasn't appealing. It was a collection of criminals, fugitives, poets, and people who'd made poor romantic choices. What father looked at that and thought, yes, perfect husband for my daughter? None. 0 fathers. So the proper approach had failed. The civilized approach had failed, which meant what remained were improper approaches, uncivilized solutions. Gentle, soft, Romulus stared at the ceiling and let the idea form. Not fully formed yet, just shadows of plan, outline of terrible necessity. the shape of something that might work if he was willing to pay the price. He was willing. That was the problem. He'd already killed his brother over walls. What wouldn't he do to make those walls matter? Outside, Rome slept. Some guard walked the walls. Some light burned in a workshop. Some dog barked at shadows. The sounds of a city, almost, missing something essential. Missing the sound of mothers singing to children. Of families arguing about nothing important. Of future happening in present tense. He closed his eyes and saw Remus's face. Not dying, just normal. Making jokes about serious things, asking the question with his presence. Was this worth it? Not yet, but maybe. If he could figure out the women problem, if he could build something that lasted, gentle, he would figure it out. He had to. Because the alternative was admitting that all of this was just elaborate delay before inevitable failure. And Romulus was many things. Fratricide, king, builder of walls, bearer of impossible guilt. But he wasn't someone who accepted inevitable failure. Not while he still had options. Even terrible ones. Gentle. Soft. Especially terrible ones. Tomorrow, he would start planning. Tonight, he could still pretend he was undecided. It was a small comfort. But Rome ran on small comforts these days. Small comforts and impossible mathematics, and the desperate hope that terrible solutions could somehow produce non-terrible outcomes. The gods, presumably, were watching. Romulus hoped they had a sense of humor about what came next. He suspected they wouldn't. But then, the gods never did. Morning arrived with the particular brightness that comes after sleepless nights, as if the sun were mocking your exhaustion. Romulus rose from his bed feeling like someone had replaced his bones with clay that hadn't quite dried yet. 23 years old, and his body was already negotiating terms of surrender. This was either kingship or just being human, and he suspected it was both, which seemed excessive. Gentle. He walked through the settlement as it woke, watching Rome become itself again. The rhythm was becoming familiar now. Men emerging from shelters, stretching, complaining about the cold or the heat or the fundamental injustice of consciousness. Someone was already arguing about something near the well. Someone else was burning breakfast with the confidence of a person who'd mistaken repetition for learning. Titus's inconveniently placed shelter still blocked the path to the spring, and people still walked around it with the resignation of those who'd accepted that some problems were permanent. Near the morning fire, Cloela was lecturing someone about their cooking technique. "That's not roasting," she was saying, pointing at something that was either meat or evidence. "That's just hoping fire solves your problems, which is how most Roman cooking works, and why most Roman food tastes like regret." Romulus kept walking. Rome's morning chaos was its own kind of order. Loud, inefficient, somehow functional, despite violating every principle of organization. It worked the way things work when nobody knows the proper method, and everyone's too stubborn to admit failure. He found a Chattes near the Capitoline, overseeing the morning work crews. His friend looked tired in the specific way people look when they've been awake thinking about someone else's problems, and have concluded those problems are now unavoidably theirs too. "Gentle, we need to talk," a Chattes said, which was never how good conversations started. They walked toward the wall, away from ears that might carry words to people who didn't need to hear them yet. The morning was cool, the sky clear, the kind of weather that made you believe everything might work out despite all available evidence suggesting otherwise. "I've been thinking," Romulus said carefully. "About the women problem," Acutes said. Not a question. Gentle, soft. "About the women problem," Romulus confirmed. "We can't keep doing nothing. The mathematics don't improve through hoping. We need women. Neighboring cities won't give us their daughters. So we need to," he paused, "invite them differently." Achetay stopped walking. "Invite them differently," he repeated slowly. "That's diplomatic language for something I'm not going to like, isn't it?" "I'm planning to hold a festival," Romulus said. "Religious celebration, athletic games, food, wine, entertainment. We invite neighboring cities, whole families, not just men. Create something that looks like peace and friendship. And then, when everyone's comfortable, you'll take the women." Kate finished. "We ask them to stay. Very directly. Dental. That's kidnapping with event planning," Achate said flatly. Romulus looked at his friend directly. It's the only solution that doesn't involve Rome dying in one generation or waiting for divine intervention that clearly isn't coming. We've tried asking nicely, we've sent embassies, we've offered trade agreements, every city said no, so we use the methods that remain. They stood in silence for a moment, watching the city below them. Rome in morning light looked almost legitimate, walls solid, buildings rising, smoke suggesting domesticity. It looked like something that might last, if you didn't count the population and do basic mathematics about how many children 14 women could produce. This will start wars, Achates said quietly. Probably, Romulus agreed, but we'll win them. We have walls, trained men, defensive advantage. And after we integrate the defeated, families of the women can settle here, join us, become Roman, turn enemies into citizens. We've done it before. Gentle but his. We've done it once, Achates corrected. That's not a pattern yet. That's barely a precedent. Then we make it a pattern, Romulus said. Rome will specialize in taking what it needs and making it belong. That can be a founding principle. A thoughtful, soft-studied Romulus's face, reading in it the determination that had built walls and established laws and killed a brother over divine signs. You've already decided, he said. I've already decided, Romulus confirmed. The question isn't whether. The question is when, how, and which cities we invite. I'm thinking the Sabines. They're populous, close, and they've been the most insulting in their refusals. Gentle, soft revenge, Achates observed. This is also practical, Romulus corrected. But if it's also revenge, I won't pretend I mind. Achates sighed the way people sigh when they know they're going to help with something they disapprove of. You don't need my approval. You need my help planning it so fewer people die than absolutely necessary. Exactly. You're a terrible king, Achates said without heat. But at least you're consistently terrible. There's something to be said for reliability. Gentle, soft. They spent the morning planning, not the abduction itself that would come later, after trust had been established and then catastrophically violated, but the groundwork. What kind of festival would make it appealing enough that whole families would come, not just young men looking for trouble, or old men looking for diplomatic incidents? Games, Achates suggested. Athletic competitions, chariot races, wrestling. Show Roman strength in controlled, entertaining ways. Make it seem like celebration, not preparation for anything else. A religious festival, Romulus added. Dedicated to Consus, god of stored grain. Makes it sacred. People respect sacred things right up until they don't. But it buys us trust initially. Food and wine, Achates continued. Abundant. We want people relaxed, comfortable. We want them to bring their families because it seems safe. Gentle. And then, Romulus prompted. And then you signal. Adjust your cloak or something ceremonial, and the men move quickly. Secure the unmarried women inside the walls before anyone can organize resistance. We don't harm anyone unless necessary, Romulus said firmly. This isn't about violence. The women will be treated with respect. Proper marriages, proper houses, proper rights as Roman citizens. Their children will be Roman. This isn't slavery. It's thoughtful below. A very aggressive immigration policy, Achates supplied. It's necessity, Romulus said quietly, and I'll live with that. They returned to the settlement and began the work of organizing. First, Rome needed to seem legitimate, worth visiting, not obviously a trap waiting to spring. Over the following weeks, Romulus sent embassies to nearby settlements. Not marriage proposals this time. Those had failed spectacularly. Just neighborly communication, trade discussions, diplomatic courtesies, the boring, normal interactions between cities that suggested Rome was becoming respectable. He sent gifts, modest ones, nothing so extravagant it seemed like bribery. Grain, wine, metalwork from Rome's growing craftsmen. He offered to mediate disputes between other towns, positioning Rome as neutral party rather than threat. He invited minor officials to visit, showed them the walls, the organization, the evidence that suggested civilization rather than chaos. Thoughtful, grudgingly. Rome's reputation shifted, not to friendly. Nobody trusted the city of criminals that much, but to less immediately threatening. From maybe they'll raid us, to maybe they're actually building something real. It was progress. Small, tedious progress, but progress nonetheless. Meanwhile, Romulus organized Rome internally. The city needed structure if it was going to absorb new people, especially people who'd been brought against their will and would need convincing that staying was preferable to fleeing. He established the Senate formally, 100 men chosen from what he generously called the leading families. Most Roman families at this point consisted of one man and his questionable life choices, but Romulus picked men who seemed competent and marginally less likely than average to make catastrophically bad decisions under pressure. He called them patrae, fathers of the city. Their descendants would be known as patricians, though at the moment they were mostly just confused refugees wondering why they'd been given important-sounding titles and actual responsibilities. The first Senate meeting lasted 4 hours and accomplished almost nothing. 100 men, none of them trained in governance, all of them with opinions, sitting in a room that was too small and arguing about everything from well placement to whether certain livestock counted as taxable property or spiritual entities. It was like a group project where everyone had done different reading and nobody had checked if they were working on the same assignment. Gentle, Romulus let them argue until his patience, never his strongest quality, ran out entirely. Then he banged his staff on the ground and declared that while democracy was beautiful in theory, they had actual work to do, and could they please focus on things that mattered. The goat taxation question, he announced, would be revisited never. He divided Rome into 3 tribes, the Ramners, Titienses and Luceres, representing the Latin, Sabine and Etruscan elements that had somehow mixed together into whatever Rome was becoming. Each tribe was further divided into 10 curiae, wards responsible for local organization and governance. For military purposes, each curiae would provide 100 foot soldiers and 10 cavalry. On paper, this gave Rome 3,000 infantry and 300 cavalry, which sounded impressive until you remembered that in reality, it gave Rome about 2,000 men who knew which end of a spear was dangerous, and maybe 100 who could stay on a horse for more than 10 minutes. But numbers on paper mattered when neighboring cities were calculating whether Rome was worth attacking, so Romulus emphasized the paper numbers and quietly continued training people to match them. The 300 cavalry became known as the Celerus, the Swift, and served as Romulus's personal guard. Outcasts commanded them with the weary competence of someone who'd realized his job was now preventing the king from doing anything too stupid in situations where people were watching. It was, Romulus admitted to himself late one night while reviewing his organizational charts, actually kind of impressive. Rome had structure now. Laws, military organization, governmental systems that looked legitimate if you didn't examine them too closely. It looked like a real city instead of an ambitious refugee camp with delusions of grandeur, and one inconveniently placed shelter blocking the main path. It was also still going to die in 1 generation unless the festival plan worked. As summer approached, Romulus made his announcement. Rome would host a great festival in honor of Consus, god of stored grain. Athletic competitions, chariot races, feasting, entertainment. All neighboring cities were invited, whole families welcome. A celebration of peace, prosperity, and good neighborly relations. The invitations were beautiful. Carved tablets with formal language emphasizing Rome's desire for friendship and cooperation. They were worded the way legal documents are worded, technically accurate but strategically vague about the parts that might be problematic. They made no mention of Rome's demographic crisis or desperate need for women, or the plan that would be enacted once everyone was comfortable and trust had been thoroughly established and then immediately violated. Gentle, soft cities declined immediately, citing various diplomatic reasons that boiled down to, "We don't trust you." Others sent cautious acceptances, noting they'd send representatives but not whole families. But the Sabinins, populous, confident, recently insulting in their rejection of Roman marriage proposals, accepted enthusiastically. They'd send families, they said. Whole families. Their daughters had been asking about Rome, curious about the new city. Young people should meet, they wrote. Former enemies should become friends. It would be good for regional stability. Romulus read their acceptance letter 3 times, feeling guilt and determination occupy the same uncomfortable space in his chest. The Sabinines were coming in good faith. They trusted Rome. They believed in the possibility of peace and normal relations between neighbors. And Romulus was going to violate that trust so completely that historians would argue about it for centuries, and priests would have complicated opinions about whether it was justified or just convenient. But Rome needed to continue. Rome needed futures, and futures required women, and women required methods that weren't civilized or proper, or anything that would make anyone feel good about themselves afterward. That was leadership, apparently. Making decisions that kept you awake at night but had to be made anyway because the alternative was watching everything you'd built crumble into nothing. The Sabinines are coming, he told Achates one evening as they reviewed festival preparations. I know, Achates said. I read the letter. They sound excited, trusting, Like people who have no idea they're walking into a situation that's going to end very badly for everyone involved. "We'll treat the women well," Romulus said, as if repetition made it more true. "Proper marriages, proper houses, proper rights as Roman citizens. Their children will be Roman. This isn't conquest or slavery. It's necessary." "A charter's finished." "You keep saying that? And maybe you're right. Maybe this is the only way Rome survives. But necessary and right aren't the same thing, and you're going to have to live with that distinction for the rest of your life." "Gentle," Romulus said quietly. They sat in silence for a while, watching the sun set over Rome. The walls glowed golden in evening light. The settlement bustled with activity, people preparing for the festival, building temporary structures, practicing for athletic competitions, making Rome look like something worth visiting instead of a carefully constructed trap. "Do you think Remus would have done this?" Romulus asked suddenly. Ashatix considered the question seriously. "No," he said finally. "Remus would have found a different solution, probably a better one. Probably one that didn't involve mass abduction and starting wars with everyone within a day's walk." "Gentle, do you think he'd understand why I'm doing it?" "Yes," Ashate said. "He'd understand. He'd hate it, but he'd understand. That was always the difference between you two. You both wanted Rome to succeed, but he believed success should feel good. You're willing to accept that sometimes success just feels like surviving." Romulus nodded slowly. That felt true. Romulus had believed in joy, in the possibility that good things could be built through good means. Romulus believed in walls and pragmatism and the truth that cities weren't built by nice people, just by determined ones willing to do what nice people wouldn't. "Gentle, soft, the festival is in 2 weeks," he said. "I know," Achates replied. "After that, everything changes. I know that too. Are we making a mistake?" A thoughtful, Softies looked at his friend, his king, the person who'd killed his brother over walls, and was now planning something equally terrible for equally practical reasons. "Probably," he said honestly. "But we're making it anyway, because the alternative is watching Rome end, and we've put too much into this to quit now." "That's not reassuring," Romulus said. "It's becoming a pattern," Akata replied. "You should consider adding it to Rome's official motto. Rome, not reassuring since 753 BC. Despite everything, Romulus smiled. Gentle, soft together as evening deepened into night. Two men planning something terrible for necessary reasons, and felt the weight of it settle on them like snow that wouldn't melt. Rome, ignorant of the future, went about its evening business, fires burning, voices fading, the settlement settling into rhythms of people who believed tomorrow would be basically like today, just with minor variations. But tomorrow would be different. The festival would come, the Sabines would arrive, the signal would be given, and Rome would learn something it would spend the next 1,000 years proving, that sometimes cities are built not through virtue or wisdom or divine favor, but through desperate people making desperate choices, and hoping, really, really hoping, that the ends justify the means. Romulus hoped that too. But hope and certainty, he was learning, were very different things. Gentle and certainty was in short supply these days, much like women, which was, inconveniently, the entire problem. The 2 weeks before the festival passed the way time passes when you're planning something you'll definitely regret quickly for everyone else, slowly for the person who has to live with the consequences. Rome transformed itself from refugee camp to festival grounds with the enthusiastic energy of people who had no idea what they were participating in and probably wouldn't have helped if they'd known. Gentle, soft, temporary structures rose on the field below the Palatine. An amphitheatre for games, seating areas for spectators, pavilions for food and wine. The construction was ambitious and slightly chaotic, which meant it was very Roman. One pavilion leaned at an angle that suggested either architectural innovation or structural failure, and nobody could agree which. The amphitheatre seats were uneven enough that sitting in them required commitment and possibly prayer, but from a distance it looked impressive, which was the entire point. Lucius the poet had been commissioned to write a hymn for the opening ceremony. He'd produced something that rhymed consus with eponus and grain storage with moral courage, which didn't make sense thematically, but he insisted worked on levels that would become clear during performance. Romulus had listened to it once, decided that incomprehensible poetry was probably traditional for religious festivals, and approved it without further questions. The athletic competitions were organized with more success. Chariot races would be held in the flat area east of the Palatine, not a proper circus yet, just marked boundaries and hope that nobody drove into the spectators. Wrestling matches, foot races, javelin throws, all the usual demonstrations of human strength and poor decision-making that passed for entertainment. Romulus had assigned competent men to organize it, which meant it would probably work well enough that nobody died, which was Roman standards for success. Food was the real challenge. Rome needed to provide abundantly. Make the festival feel generous. Make guests feel welcome. Make everyone comfortable enough that they'd let their guard down completely. Clotilde had been placed in charge of cooking preparations, which was either brilliant or catastrophic depending on whether you asked her or anyone who had to work with her. Gentle, why try? We need 3 times this amount, she announced, looking at the supplies that had been gathered. You're planning to feed how many people? They be 500 guests, Romulus said, plus our own people, so roughly 1,500 total? And you've provided enough food for maybe 300, Clotilde observed. Did you think people would eat less because it's a festival? People eat more at festivals. That's the entire concept of festivals. Celebration through consumption. We'll get more, Romulus promised. Friendly. Warm before that isn't burned or boiled into submission, Clotilde corrected. I'm not serving food that makes Rome look like we learnt cooking from people who hate food. If we're going to do this, we're doing it properly. She was right, which was annoying but useful. Over the next week, Rome acquired more food through trade, purchase, and, in at least one case, creative interpretation of property rights. The festival would have bread, roasted meat that was actually roasted rather than cremated, vegetables prepared in ways that preserved their will to exist, and wine, lots of wine. Wine was essential to the plan, though Romulus tried not to think too hard about the ethics of making people drunk before violating their trust. As the festival date approached, delegations began arriving. Small ones at first, scouts basically, sent ahead to verify that Rome wasn't obviously planning anything terrible, and that the festival was actually happening. They were shown the preparations, given food and wine, assured that Rome's intentions were entirely peaceful and neighbourly. They seemed satisfied, or at least not immediately suspicious, and returned to their cities with reports that Rome appeared legitimate. Gentle saw 3 days before the festival, the Sabines arrived. Not the whole group, just an advance party to help with final preparations and ensure their people would be received properly. They were led by a man named Metius, who seemed friendly and trusting in the way people are when they have no reason to suspect catastrophic betrayal. This is impressive, Metius said, surveying the preparations. When we heard Rome was hosting a festival, we weren't sure what to expect, but this looks like a proper celebration. We're trying to be proper neighbours, Romulus said, feeling guilt settle in his stomach like bad bread. Rome has been rough in its early days. We want to show we're becoming something more civilized. You're succeeding, Metals assured him. Our people are excited, especially the young ones. They've been curious about Rome, the new city, the fresh start. Some of our daughters have been asking about Roman men, wondering if the rumours are true. What rumours? Romulus asked carefully. That Roman men are desperate and will marry anyone, Metius said with a laugh. Which, no offence, seems fairly accurate based on the marriage proposals we've been receiving and rejecting for months. We're eager to build families, Romulus agreed, managing a smile that felt like a mask. Rome needs futures, not just present tense. Well, who knows, Metius said. Maybe some matches will happen naturally during the festival. Young people meeting, conversations starting. That's how it should work. Choice, not arrangement. Let them decide for themselves. Let them decide, Romulus repeated, and felt the irony of it burn in his chest like wine gone sour. The day before the festival, Rome was ready. The field was prepared, the food was abundant, the wine was plentiful, and the men knew their roles. When Romulus gave the signal, adjusting his cloak in a specific way, they would move quickly, secure the unmarried women, bring them inside the walls before resistance could organize. It would be fast, efficient, and completely devastating to every ounce of trust that had been carefully built over the past weeks. That evening, Romulus walked through the empty festival grounds. Tomorrow they would be full of people, families, children, young women who were coming to celebrate and would leave as Romans whether they wanted to or not. The temporary structures cast long shadows in the setting sun, and the whole place had the eerie quality of a stage set before the actors arrive, when everything is potential and nothing has gone wrong yet. Gentle soft, Akasat asked. appearing beside him with the silent competence of someone trained to guard kings who did questionable things. Constant thoughts, Romulus corrected. All of them second, third, and fourth thoughts. But the same conclusion every time we do this or Rome dies. Those are the options. There aren't others. The Sabines seem nice, Agitades observed. They are nice, Romulus agreed. They're trusting and friendly and excited about peace. Which makes this worse, but doesn't make it less necessary. You could stop, Agitade said quietly. Even now. Call it off. Send everyone home, except that Rome ends with this generation, and at least we tried. Thoughtful, flawed Romulus looked at his friend. Could you? Could you watch everything we've built? Everyone we've brought here, everyone who's trusted us with their futures, just end because we weren't willing to do what needed doing? No, Acodids admitted. I couldn't. Which is why I'm here helping you plan it instead of trying to stop you. But I wanted you to know the option exists, even if we're not going to take it. I appreciate that, Romulus said, genuinely. They stood together in the empty festival grounds as evening deepened into night. Two men who'd crossed lines they couldn't uncross and were about to cross more, and felt the weight of tomorrow settle on them like armor that didn't fit quite right, but had to be worn anyway. The morning of the festival arrived with perfect weather. Clear skies, moderate temperature, the kind of day that made you believe the gods approved of whatever you were doing. Which, Romulus thought grimly, was either divine blessing or divine irony. With gods you never quite knew which until afterward, and sometimes not even then. Guests began arriving at dawn. Families from Antemnae and Crustumerium, delegations from smaller settlements, and, in the largest numbers, the Sabines. They came in groups, whole families walking together, dressed in their festival clothing, carrying small gifts and good intentions. Children ran ahead, excited by the spectacle. Young women walked with their mothers, curious and perhaps a little nervous, but mostly just eager to see this new city everyone had been talking about. Romulus greeted them at the entrance to the festival grounds, playing the role of gracious host with the skill of someone who'd learned that kingship was mostly performance. He welcomed families by name when he knew them, complimented children, thanked people for coming. He was charming and friendly and completely convincing, which made sense because the best lies are the ones that are mostly true. He did want them here. He was grateful they'd come. He just wasn't being entirely honest about why. By mid-morning, the festival grounds were full. Hundreds of people, maybe close to 600 guests plus Rome's own population. The amphitheatre seats were crowded despite their questionable structural integrity. Children played in open areas. Families sat together on blankets, sharing food, watching the preparations for the games. The atmosphere was festive in the genuine way festivals are when people believe they're safe and celebration is the only agenda. The games began at noon. Chariot races first, 4 teams, borrowed chariots, drivers who were competent enough that nobody died immediately, which counted as success. The races were exciting, close, full of the kind of dramatic near collisions that made spectators gasp and cheer. Rome's team won 2 out of 3 races, which seemed suspicious until you remembered that Rome's drivers had been practicing on this specific course for 2 weeks while everyone else was seeing it for the first time. The foot races were more democratic. A young Sabine won the sprint, running with the easy grace of someone who'd spent his life chasing sheep or fleeing consequences. A Latin won the distance race through what appeared to be spite and refusal to acknowledge that his body wanted to stop. The javelin throw was won by a Roman, but only because the Sabine competitor's javelin went significantly farther than intended and landed in a food pavilion, which was impressive but technically disqualifying. Between events, Lucius performed his hymn to Consus. It was exactly as incomprehensible as Romulus had expected, but the audience clapped politely, which was all you could ask from poetry that rhymed grain storage with moral courage. A few priests made offerings at a temporary altar. Wine, bread, the usual items you gave gods when asking them to overlook what you were about to do. The feast began in late afternoon. Tables had been set up, or rather boards laid across supports that were optimistically called tables, and food was distributed with the organized chaos that characterized all Roman endeavors. Clovel had outdone herself. The food was not only edible but actually good. Roasted meat that tasted like meat rather than charcoal. Bread that hadn't been murdered by incompetence. Vegetables that retained structural integrity. It was impressive enough that several Sabine families asked for recipes, which Clovel had provided while pointedly not mentioning that the secret was simply not burning everything. Gentle, wine flowed. That was essential. Wine relaxed people, lowered guards, made everyone comfortable and friendly, and significantly less alert to danger. Romulus watched cups being refilled. watched people's faces grow flushed and happy, watched the festival transform from organized event into genuine celebration. Sabine families mixed with Roman families. Young people talked and laughed together. Children played games that required no language except enthusiasm. It was, Romulus realized with uncomfortable clarity, exactly what he'd claimed to want. Neighbors becoming friends, former suspicions dissolving into cooperation, the possibility of genuine peace. If he stopped now, if he just let this be what it appeared to be, Rome would have made real progress toward becoming part of the regional community. Except Rome would still die in one generation without women, and progress didn't matter if there was no future to progress into. As the sun began its descent toward evening, Romulus stood and walked to the central platform. The signal was supposed to come during the feast, when people were most relaxed and least likely to react quickly. This was the moment. After this, there was no taking it back, no pretending it hadn't happened, no return to the careful diplomacy of the past weeks. He raised his cup, and the crowd quieted, faces turning toward him with the friendly attention of people expecting a toast or a blessing or some other normal festival conclusion. "Gentle friends," Romulus said, his voice carrying across the grounds. "Neighbors, thank you for coming to Rome, for celebrating with us, for showing that former strangers can become allies. You've honored us with your presence and your trust." The crowd murmured appreciation. Some raised their cups in return. They were happy, comfortable, completely unprepared for what came next. Romulus adjusted his cloak, pulled it up over his left shoulder in a motion that looked casual, ordinary, like fixing clothing that had shifted during the speech. But it wasn't casual. It was the signal. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. The crowd still smiled, still waited for the rest of the speech. Then, like a wave beginning far from shore, movement started. Roman men rose from their seats. Not all at once, that would have been too obvious, but in coordinated groups. They moved toward the Sabine families, specifically toward the young women, with the purposeful speed of people executing a plan they'd practiced. At first it looked almost like friendliness. Roman men approaching Sabine women, offering hands as if to dance or walk, or simply continue conversation. Gentle. Then the women were being guided, firmly, quickly toward the walls. Some went willingly at first, confused but not yet frightened. Others resisted immediately, pulling back, calling for their families. The Roman men held firm, not violently but insistently, moving with the efficiency of soldiers carrying out orders. The moment of confusion lasted perhaps 10 seconds. Then someone screamed, and understanding hit the crowd like cold water. The Sabine families realized what was happening. Their daughters being taken, the friendly festival revealing itself as trap. The trust they'd brought dissolved in an instant. Chaos erupted. Sabine fathers rushed toward their daughters. Roman men blocked them, not attacking but forming human barriers, creating space for the women to be moved toward the walls. Shouting filled the air, demands to stop, threats of vengeance, screams of anger and betrayal. Some Sabine men drew weapons they'd brought despite this being supposedly peaceful. Roman men drew weapons in response. No killing. Romulus's voice cut through the chaos, amplified by urgency and the reality that this could spiral into massacre very quickly. Hold them back but don't kill. Let the families go, just hold them back. The Roman men obeyed, mostly. They pushed Sabine fathers back, wrestled weapons away, created enough space and confusion that the women could be moved inside the walls. It wasn't clean or easy or anything that would make anyone proud. It was brutal efficiency wrapped in barely controlled chaos, which Romulus reflected grimly was very Roman. Gentle, soft. The Sabine women were terrified. Some fought, hitting and clawing at the Roman men who held them. Some went silent with shock. Some called for their fathers, their mothers, their families being driven back by the Roman men who formed an impenetrable line between families and daughters. The younger children were released. Roman men passing them back to their families with care that would have seemed kind if the whole situation weren't catastrophic. But the unmarried women were held, moved inside the walls, secured inside buildings where their families couldn't reach them. The entire abduction took perhaps 5 minutes. 5 minutes to transform celebration into trauma, peace into war, trust into ashes. When it was done, the Sabine families stood outside the walls, minus their daughters, staring at the Romans with expressions that mixed shock, rage, and something worse, betrayal. They'd come in good faith. They'd believed Rome was sincere about peace. They'd trusted Metius, who'd helped prepare the festival, who'd assured his people Rome was safe. stood at the front of the crowd with the look of a man who'd just watched his entire understanding of the world collapse. "You," he started, voice shaking. "You invited us here. We trusted you." "I know," Romulus said from the wall, his voice carrying across the suddenly silent field. "And I'm sorry, but Rome needed this. Rome needed futures, and you wouldn't give them to us." "Gentle, so you took them," Metius said. "You took our daughters. They'll be safe," Romulus said. "They'll be honored. They'll be given proper marriages, proper homes, proper rights as Roman citizens. Their children will be Roman. This isn't slavery or conquest. This is thoughtful, soft," Metius finished, voice like stone. "This is betrayal. This is war. If it's war, we'll fight it," Romulus said. "But understand, your daughters are inside these walls now. They're under Rome's protection. If you attack us, you attack them. If you try to take them back by force, they'll be caught in the fighting. Is that what you want?" The Sabine fathers looked at each other, at the walls, at the reality of the situation settling on them like weight they couldn't lift. Their daughters were inside. Rome was fortified. A frontal assault would be bloody and might harm the very people they were trying to rescue. "You'll pay for this," Metius said quietly. "Maybe not today, maybe not next week, but you'll pay. Rome will pay. Every city here will remember what you did." "Dutchen told keenly." "I know," Romulus said again. "Send your ambassadors tomorrow. We'll discuss terms, marriages, integration. Your daughters will be treated with respect. You'll be able to visit, verify their safety. Some of you might even choose to settle here, be part of what we're building. This doesn't have to end in blood." "Oh, it already has," Metius said. And then, because there was nothing else to do, because their daughters were lost and Rome was impregnable, and rage alone couldn't solve problems, the Sabine families began the long walk home. They left slowly, looking back at the walls, at the city that had trapped their daughters, burning the sight of it into memory, so they'd never forget which city had betrayed them. The other families, from Antemne, Crustumerium, the smaller settlements, left even faster, wanting nothing to do with Rome or its festivals or its lies ever again. By sunset, the festival grounds were empty, except for abandoned belongings. Cups dropped in chaos, blankets left behind, children's toys forgotten in panic. The temporary structures stood like monuments to betrayal. The amphitheatre, which had hosted such enthusiastic games just hours ago, sat empty and accusatory. Gentle, soft Romulus stood on the wall and watched the last families disappear into distance. Rome had survived. Rome had futures now. Rome had women who would bear children who would be Roman, who would carry the city forward into centuries. Rome also had blood on its hands and enemies at every border, and the kind of reputation that takes generations to repair if it can be repaired at all. Inside the walls, the abducted women were being settled into buildings, given space, treated with care by Roman men who were trying very hard to seem less threatening than they'd been 10 minutes ago. It wasn't working particularly well. The women were terrified, angry, grieving. Some screamed, some wept, some sat in silent shock. All of them understood exactly what had happened and exactly how much their world had changed in the space of minutes. Tomorrow, Romulus would speak to them. Tomorrow he would try to explain, justify, convince them that staying was better than fleeing. Tomorrow he would begin the long work of turning abducted women into willing Roman citizens. But tonight, he stood on the wall and felt the weight of what he'd done settle on him like armor made of guilt. He'd saved Rome. He'd probably damned himself in the process. Both things were true, and neither one made the other easier to carry. The gods, presumably, were watching. Gentle, Romulus wondered if they were judging or just taking notes. Either way, it was done. Rome had futures now. What those futures would cost was a question for tomorrow. Gentle, and all the tomorrows after that. Three months passed before the Sabines moved. 3 months of careful silence, of ambassadors arriving and leaving with neutral expressions, of polite messages about arranging visits for families who wanted to see their daughters. 3 months that felt like peace, but carried the weight of something else. The specific quiet that comes before thunder, when the air changes and you know the storm is coming, but not exactly when. Gentle. Rome used the time well. The walls were reinforced. The men trained. The women, Roman and Sabine, both worked to build something that resembled normal life, though normal was a word that had become complicated since the festival. Some of the Sabine women had married. Some remained defiantly unmarried but had established households, routines, identities as Roman citizens who'd gotten there through terrible means but were making the best of terrible circumstances. Hersilia had emerged as the unofficial leader of the Sabine women, negotiating with Romulus about rights and freedoms with the sharp competence of someone who'd decided that if she was stuck in Rome, Rome was going to operate by principles that made sense. She'd been married in that 3-month span, not to Romulus, though several people had suggested it would be politically convenient, to a Roman named Hostus Hostilius, a decent man who'd courted her with the nervous respect of someone who understood that consent was already compromised, and he should probably be very careful about everything forever. "Do you love him?" Romulus had asked her once, when they were reviewing the latest requests from the Sabine women for expanded freedoms. "I tolerate him," Hersilia had replied, "which is more than I tolerate you, so count that as success." "That's fair," Romulus admitted. "Gentle," Hersilia added after a moment. "And he tries, and he understands that our marriage exists in the space between I had no better options and this could be worse. That's honest, at least. I appreciate honesty after spending time with you. Friendly, warm. I was honest about why we took you," Romulus protested. "Thoughtful, eventually," Hersilia corrected. "After you'd lied about the festival. Honesty after betrayal doesn't count as much as you think it does." She was right, which was annoying but useful. Romulus had learned to listen to her because she was usually right about things, including how terrible his decisions were and how long it would take for people to stop being angry about them. Her current estimate was decades, minimum, possibly generations. Then, in the 4th month after the festival, the Sabines came. Came not with a small angry force like Cainina, not with 300 men and dramatic charges. The Sabines came with an army, a real army, thousands of soldiers, organized and supplied and led by King Titus Tatius, who'd spent 3 months planning this assault with the careful attention of someone who'd watched other cities fail and learned from their mistakes. They appeared at dawn, covering the hills north of Rome like a forest that had suddenly decided to march. The numbers were difficult to estimate, maybe 3,000 men, maybe more. Enough that Rome's walls suddenly felt less like impregnable fortress and more like optimistic boundary lines drawn by people who hoped walls would matter more than they actually did. Romulus stood on the wall and watched them arrive. Titus Tatius rode at the front, older than Romulus had expected, perhaps 50, with grey in his beard and the bearing of someone who'd been a warrior before he'd been a king and remembered how both roles worked. He looked tired and angry and determined in ways that suggested this wasn't going to be resolved through diplomacy or by killing their king in single combat. "That's a lot of Sabines," Ashates observed, standing beside Romulus with the careful calm of someone who'd already done the mathematics and decided they were problematic. "That's all the Sabines," Romulus corrected. "That's not an army from one Sabine city." "Gentle. Soft, this is serious," Ashates said. "Tearful. This is extremely serious," Romulus agreed. "Which means we can't fight them directly. We need them to come to us, fight on our terms, make the walls matter." "They won't assault the walls," Ashates predicted. "They'll try for the citadel, control the high ground, cut off our water, starve us out. That's what I'd do." "That's what I'd do too," Romulus admitted. "Which means we need to make sure they can't." The Sabines made camp north of Rome, settling in for what was clearly going to be a proper siege rather than an impulsive assault. They built their own fortifications, organized supply lines, sent scouts to assess Rome's defenses. Tatius was playing this carefully. No dramatic charges, no emotional mistakes, just professional military action executed by someone who'd done this before. On the 3rd day, Tatius sent an ambassador requesting to meet Romulus outside the walls under truce. Romulus agreed, bringing Achates and a small guard force, meeting the Sabine king in the neutral ground between Rome's walls and the Sabine camp. Tatius was tall, weathered, with the kind of face that suggested he'd seen too much and stopped being surprised by human behavior decades ago. He looked at Romulus with the expression of someone examining a particularly disappointing piece of craftsmanship. "You're young," Tatius said. "Not an insult exactly, just an observation." "I'm 23, Romulus replied. "Old enough to build a city, apparently." "Old enough to steal daughters," Tatius corrected. "That's what this is about, you know that." "I know that," Romulus agreed. "And I know you're here to get them back. But they're Roman citizens now. Some are married, some are pregnant. All are protected by Rome's walls and laws. I can't give them back even if I wanted to." "Can't or won't." "Both," Romulus said honestly. "Rome needed them. Rome still needs them. and they've begun building lives here, some willingly, some because they had no better options. Sending them back would just disrupt lives that are already complicated enough. Thesaurus studied him for a long moment. "You understand this is war," he said. "Not skirmishes like Canina, actual war. My people want their daughters back. They want justice. They want you to understand that you can't just take what you want and hide behind walls." "I understand," Romulus said. "And I'm prepared to defend Rome. But I'd rather not. I'd rather negotiate, arrange visits, allow families to settle near their daughters, create relationships that benefit everyone. War won't get your daughters back. It'll just create more loss." "You're good at this," Theseus observed. "The reasonable voice, the logical arguments, the appeals to pragmatism. I imagine it works often." "Usually," Romulus admitted. "Gentle, soft." "It won't work now," Tatius said. "My people need to see that Rome can be challenged. That taking our daughters has consequences. That walls don't make you invincible." He paused. "We'll take the citadel, cut off your water, force you to negotiate from weakness rather than strength, and then we'll see if you're still this reasonable." "The citadel is fortified," Romulus said carefully. "The citadel is defended by Romans," Tatius corrected. "And Romans, in my experience, are desperate people who make desperate choices. Desperation is useful sometimes, but it's also a weakness if you know how to exploit it." The meeting ended without resolution, which had been predictable. Both sides understood this was going to be decided through force, not conversation. The question was whose force would matter more, Rome's defensive advantage or the Sabine's superior numbers and organization. That night, the Sabines made their move. They approached the citadel quietly, using darkness and careful planning to get close before being detected. The citadel, Rome's highest point, controlling the Capitoline Hill, was defended by a garrison under the command of a Roman officer named Spurius Tarpeius. The garrison was adequate, the defences were solid, and everything should have held. Everything would have held, except for Tarpeius's daughter. Her name was Tarpeia, and she was young and probably naive and definitely made a decision that would ensure her name was remembered for all the wrong reasons. The exact details would be argued about for centuries. Some said she was bribed, some said she was promised marriage, some said she was just stupid, but the result was the same. She opened the gates and let the Sabines in. By dawn, the Sabines controlled the citadel, Rome's high ground, its strategic advantage, its water supply, all compromised because one girl had made one catastrophically bad decision. Spurius Tarpeius was dead, killed trying to stop the betrayal. His daughter was also dead, killed by the Sabines she'd helped, either because they despised traitors even when the traitors were useful, or because she'd asked for what they wore on their arms, expecting gold bracelets and received shields instead, or because the Sabines wanted to make sure Rome understood that betrayal had consequences. The exact cause of death mattered less than the result. Tarpeia was dead, thrown from the cliffs that would carry her name forever as warning about treachery. The Sabines held the high ground, and Rome was suddenly fighting a defensive war from a position of disadvantage. Romulus ordered Rome to prepare for assault. The Sabines wouldn't stay on the citadel. They'd come down, force battle, try to break Rome's defences while they had momentum. The question was whether Rome could hold when fighting uphill against a numerically superior force that controlled the strategic position. The battle came at midday. The Sabines descended from the citadel in organized formations, shields locked, spears ready, moving with the discipline of men who'd trained for exactly this. Rome met them in the valley between the Capitoline and Palatine, the space that would later be called the Forum, but was currently just open ground where two armies were about to test each other's commitment. The fighting was immediate and ugly. Not heroic or dramatic or anything that would look good in later artistic representations, just men with weapons trying to create space where no space existed. The Sabines pushed forward with superior numbers. The Romans held through desperate determination, and the knowledge that retreat meant losing everything they'd built. Thoughtfuls from Romulus fought in the front, which was either inspiring leadership or poor strategic planning, depending on whether you thought kings should be visible or alive. He fought with the focused intensity of someone who'd killed his brother over walls, and wasn't about to let those walls fall to anyone else. Around him, men he'd granted asylum to, men he'd organized into tribes and centuries, men who'd become Roman because Rome was the only place that would take them. They fought because Rome was theirs now, for better or worse. The battle swayed back and forth. The Sabines would gain ground, pushing the Romans back toward the Palatine. Then the Romans would rally, drive forward, reclaim space that had been lost. Men fell on both sides, not dramatically, not with final speeches, just falling and not getting up, because that's what happens when metal finds flesh and flesh stops working. At one point, a Sabine warrior on horseback. His name was Metius Curtius, the same man who'd helped prepare the festival and trusted Rome and then watched his people's daughters stolen, drove deep into Roman lines. He fought with suicidal bravery, cutting through Roman defenders, heading directly for Romulus with the clear intention of ending the war by ending the king. Gentle, he would have succeeded, except for geography. There was a marsh in that part of the valley, seasonal water that collected in low ground and created mud that looked solid until you put weight on it. Curtius's horse plunged into it, sank, struggled. The warrior had to abandon his mount, retreat on foot, barely escaping the Romans who converged on him. The marsh saved him and trapped him, and forever after would be called Lacus Curtius, the Lake of Curtius, commemorating either his bravery or his terrible luck depending on how generous you felt towards Sabine warriors who tried to kill Roman kings. The Romans were losing. Not dramatically, but steadily. Pushed back by numbers, by the Sabines' control of high ground, by the reality that desperate defenders could only hold so long against organized assault. Romulus could feel it in the way his men moved, the way their lines bent without quite breaking, the way victory was slipping away like water through fingers. He made a vow. Right there, in the middle of battle, with Sabines pressing forward and Romans dying and everything falling apart, he shouted to Jupiter Stator, the stayer, the god who keeps things from collapsing. Jupiter, he called, loud enough to be heard over battle. Keep my line from breaking. Hold us together. I'll build you a temple if you just keep us from running. Whether Jupiter heard or cared or did anything was debatable. But the Romans held, the lines stopped bending. Men who'd been on the edge of panic found second reserves of stubbornness. The retreat halted, stabilized, became something that resembled defensive position rather than gradual collapse. The battle continued through the afternoon, neither side gaining decisive advantage. The Sabines couldn't break Rome's lines. The Romans couldn't push the Sabines back. It was stalemate achieved through mutual exhaustion and the discovery that neither side was willing to lose more than they already had. Then, as the sun began its descent, and both armies were considering whether dying for principles was really worth it, something extraordinary happened. The Sabine women came. They'd been watching the battle from Rome's walls, watching their fathers fight their husbands, watching their brothers try to kill their children's fathers, watching the two parts of their lives try to destroy each other, and they'd apparently decided this was unacceptable. They flooded onto the battlefield, not armed, not organized, just women moving into the space between armies with the kind of desperate courage that comes from having nothing left to lose. They pushed between fighters, separated combatants, created human barriers between the two forces with their own bodies. Gentle, soft, Hercilia's voice cut through the chaos, amplified by urgency and rage, and the accumulated frustration of 3 months spent watching men make stupid decisions. Just stop, all of you, stop fighting. The fighting slowed, then stopped. Not because the armies wanted to stop, but because killing people became significantly more complicated when those people were standing next to unarmed women who were shouting at you about your poor life choices. Hercilia stood in the center, between the Roman and Sabine lines, and addressed both armies with the voice of someone who'd spent 3 months learning to speak with authority to men who thought they didn't have to listen. "We are your daughters," she called to the Sabines. "We are your wives," she called to the Romans. "We are mothers to sons who are Roman and Sabine both. And you want to make us widows? You want to make our children orphans? You want to force us to choose between fathers and husbands when we shouldn't have to choose at all?" The armies stood frozen, caught between the instinct to continue fighting and the reality that the women they were supposedly fighting over had just inserted themselves into the middle of the battle and were making excellent points about how stupid everyone was being. Gentle. "We didn't ask to be brought to Rome," Hercilia continued. "We didn't ask for any of this. But we're here now. We've made lives here. Some good, some tolerable, all complicated. And killing each other won't change that. It'll just make everything worse. So," she paused, looking between Taisquus and Romulus. "Stop being stupid. Both of you, negotiate, make peace, figure out how to share us instead of fighting over us like we're property that only one side gets to own." There was a long suspended moment where the battle could have resumed, where men could have decided that female intervention didn't matter and principles were more important than listening. But neither army moved. Both kings stood there, looking at the women who'd just walked into a battlefield and announced that everyone involved was being ridiculous and realized they didn't have good counter-arguments. Tarsios looked at Romulus across the field of paused violence. "Your women are brave," he said, loud enough to be heard. "They're not my women," Romulus called back. "They're Romans who have opinions, and they're right. We should negotiate." "We should," Tartius agreed. "Gentle." And so, because neither king wanted to be the one who refused to listen to the women who'd just risked their lives to stop a battle, because both armies were exhausted and bloodied, and questioning whether this was worth it, because Hersilia and the other Sabine women had created a space where peace was suddenly more reasonable than war, the fighting ended. Not permanently, not yet, but enough to talk, enough to consider alternatives, enough to admit that maybe, just maybe, there was a way forward that didn't require more corpses. The armies withdrew to their respective camps. The women remained in the center, guarding the space they'd created, refusing to move until both sides agreed to genuine negotiation rather than tactical retreat. And Romulus, standing on the battlefield surrounded by the evidence of how close Rome had come to losing everything, realized that the women Rome had taken against their will had just saved it through choice. The irony wasn't lost on him. Neither was the lesson. Sometimes the people you wrong become the people who save you, not because you deserve it, but because they're better than you are. The negotiation took 3 days. 3 days of Romulus and Titus Tatius sitting in a tent between their armies, surrounded by witnesses and mediators, and the accumulated tension of two peoples who'd just tried to kill each other and were now supposed to figure out how to live together. The women attended, not as decorations or symbols, but as participants, because Hersilia had made it very clear that any agreement made without their input would be ignored and possibly sabotaged. The first day was mostly arguing about whose fault everything was, which was cathartic but unproductive. The Sabines blamed Rome for the abduction. The Romans blamed the Sabines for refusing peaceful marriage negotiations. Everyone blamed everyone, and by the end of the day nobody felt better, but at least they'd gotten the yelling out of their systems. The second day was about practicalities. What would peace actually look like? The Sabines wanted their daughters back, but the daughters, or at least some of them, said they'd built lives in Rome and weren't interested in returning to families that had just tried to start a war over them. Some women wanted to leave, some wanted their families to join them in Rome, some wanted a third option that nobody had invented yet. It was Hersilia who suggested the solution that would eventually become the foundation of everything. "Make us one city," she said, interrupting an argument about property rights and marriage law. "Not Rome with Sabine guests. Not two cities allied but separate. One city, with two kings, shared governance, integrated peoples. If you're going to force us to be Roman, make Rome something we can actually be proud of." The tent went silent. Both kings looked at her, then at each other, then back at her, trying to determine if she was serious or just exhausted by male inability to solve problems without elaborate complexity. "Two kings," Tatius said slowly, "in one city. That's unconventional." "Friendly, warm. Everything about this situation is unconventional," Hersilia replied. "You might as well embrace it." Romulus considered the proposal. It was ambitious, potentially disastrous, and completely unprecedented. Kings didn't share power. Kings competed, fought. One eventually eliminated the other through war or assassination or convenient accidents involving stairs. That's how kingship worked. Gentle, but then, Rome had already violated most traditional rules about city founding. It had been built by criminals, populated through mass abduction, defended by desperate pragmatism. Why not add "ruled by two kings" simultaneously to the list of things that shouldn't work but might? What would that look like? Romulus asked. Practically, who makes decisions? Who commands the army? Who judges disputes? "You figure it out," Hersilia said. "You're both kings. You're both supposedly wise leaders. Try negotiating like adults instead of children fighting over who gets the bigger piece." On the third day, they hammered out details. Romulus and Tatius would rule jointly, co-kings with equal authority and shared responsibility. They'd alternate certain duties, consult on major decisions, divide governance in ways that prevented constant conflict. Romulus would handle military and external affairs, his strength. Tatius would manage religious ceremonies and Sabine integration, his expertise. The city would be reorganized to reflect the merger. The existing 3 tribes would be expanded. Sabine families incorporated into the structure, not added as separate entities. Intermarriage would be encouraged, legalized, celebrated. Roman and Sabine gods would be worshipped together, their temples sharing space, their festivals merged into new traditions that belonged to neither people, and both simultaneously. Property would be redistributed. Sabine families settling in Rome would receive land, housing, citizenship rights identical to Romans. The abducted women would have legal protections, rights to property, inheritance, divorce if marriages proved unbearable. Their children would be fully Roman, fully Sabine, fully legitimate heirs to whatever future this merged people created. It was, Romulus admitted privately to Achates, probably the best outcome they could have hoped for, given that they'd started from committed mass abduction and somehow arrived at joint governance and cultural integration. Cheerful, friendly, warm. I know, Romulus agreed. The women are saving us despite us. That seems to be becoming a pattern. The agreement was formalized with oaths, sacrifices and elaborate ceremonies that satisfied everyone's need for sacred validation of fundamentally pragmatic arrangements. Romulus and Thaís swore mutual loyalty before both peoples, promising to rule jointly, fairly, without attempting to murder each other, which really shouldn't have needed to be explicitly stated but absolutely did. The armies withdrew. The Sabines didn't go home. They came to Rome, bringing families, possessions, skills, complications. The city that had been exclusively male and desperate suddenly became something more complex. Women and children filled streets. Sabine craftsmen brought techniques Romans didn't know. Families merged, sometimes smoothly, sometimes through determined effort, and the recognition that cooperation was preferable to the alternatives. Rome, which had been one thing, became another thing. Larger, more diverse, more complicated, probably more functional, though that would take time to prove. The walls that had been built to protect Roman men now enclosed a community that was neither purely Roman nor purely Sabine, but some mixture that would need a generation or two to fully cohere. Living with Tatius proved less terrible than Romulus had feared. The Sabine king was practical, experienced, and possessed the valuable quality of not trying to make everything a competition. They divided responsibilities and discovered they could work together when both wanted the same outcome, a stable city that didn't collapse into civil war before either of them died naturally. They had disagreements, obviously. Tatius wanted more religious festivals than Romulus thought necessary. Romulus wanted to expand the walls faster than Tatius felt was wise. They argued about tax policy, building priorities, whether certain hills should be developed or preserved as sacred spaces. But they argued productively, and when they couldn't agree, they compromised, which was apparently something kings could do if circumstances forced them to learn. The first joint Senate meeting was chaos. 100 Roman senators plus however many Sabines Tatius brought. The exact number was disputed, all trying to express opinions simultaneously about everything. It took 3 hours and accomplished nothing except establishing that combining two governments was more complicated than anyone had anticipated. Romulus and Tatius sat together on what was technically one throne, but practically two chairs pushed close together, which looked ridiculous but accurately represented their political situation. After the third hour of senators arguing about whether the city should prioritize road improvements or temple construction, Tatius leaned over and whispered to Romulus, "Is it always like this?" "Friendly." "Warm." "Usually worse," Romulus whispered back. "You'll get used to it, or you'll learn to leave early and let them argue without us." "That seems irresponsible," Tatius observed. "It's very irresponsible," Romulus agreed, "but also necessary for maintaining sanity." Gradually, awkwardly, Rome integrated. Roman men married Sabine women with more genuine courtship, now that kidnapping wasn't the primary dating strategy. Sabine men married Roman women, the few who'd been there originally, and daughters born from the first wave of mixed marriages. Children grew up speaking both Latin and Sabine, worshipping both sets of gods, belonging to a place that was becoming something new. There were tensions, obviously. Some Romans resented the Sabines for taking resources, land, influence. Some Sabines never fully forgave Rome for the abduction, never stopped seeing Romans as kidnappers who'd gotten away with crimes through forced integration. But most people, most of the time, chose pragmatism over grudges because grudges were exhausting and pragmatism put food on tables. The city grew, not just in population but in infrastructure, organization, complexity. New buildings rose, some Roman style, some Sabine, some hybrid designs that emerged when people from different traditions tried to solve the same problems together. New streets connected previously separate neighborhoods. New temples housed gods that had never shared space before but were learning to coexist because their worshippers were coexisting. Drental became, despite everything, despite its terrible founding and worse methods, a place where integration actually worked. Not perfectly. Nothing worked perfectly when you built a city from criminals and abduction victims and desperate alliances, but well enough that people stayed, built, raised children, believed in futures. One evening, perhaps 2 years into the joint kingship, Romulus walked through the city with Tatius, reviewing progress and discussing disputes that needed attention. It was routine now, comfortable even, this partnership that shouldn't have worked but did through necessity and unexpected compatibility. They passed a market where Roman and Sabine merchants traded side by side, their children playing together in the street while parents negotiated prices and gossiped about neighbours. They passed temples where both people's gods received offerings, priests coordinating festivals that honoured traditions from both cultures. They passed homes where mixed families lived, Roman fathers and Sabine mothers, or Sabine fathers and Roman mothers, or more complicated arrangements that had emerged when people decided love was more interesting than ethnic purity. "You've built something unusual," Tatius observed. "Something that probably shouldn't exist but does anyway." "We've built it," Romulus corrected. "You're king here too. You get credit and blame equally." "Friendly. Warm. That's fair," Tatius admitted. "Though I notice you're very good at sharing blame, and less enthusiastic about sharing credit." "I contain multitudes," Romulus said, which was becoming his standard response to criticism about his character flaws. They stood together on the wall, the same wall Romulus had built, and Remus had died over, now protecting a city neither brother could have imagined, and watched Rome settle into evening. Fires being lit, families gathering for meals, the ordinary sounds of a city at peace, or at least not actively at war, which counted as peace in Rome's particular circumstances. "Thoughtful. Do you think it will last?" Tatius asked. "This arrangement, 2 kings, merged peoples, forced integration becoming genuine community." "No idea," Romulus said honestly. "But it's lasted this long, which is more than I expected when we started, so I'm cautiously optimistic that we can continue being lucky." "Lucky," Tatius repeated. "That's an interesting word for what this is. What word would you prefer?" Romulus asked. "Miraculous? Improbable? The result of women being more competent than men at solving problems men created?" "That last one," Tatius said. "Definitely that one." Dankled together in comfortable silence, 2 kings who'd been enemies and become something like colleagues, watching over a city that had been one thing and become another, and would probably continue becoming whatever it needed to be to survive. "Thoughtful? I should visit Remus's grave," Romulus said eventually. "Tell him about all this. He'd find it funny that I started by killing my brother over a wall and ended up sharing power with a former enemy." "Would he approve?" Tatius asked. "He'd say I should have thought of this solution before committing fratricide," Romulus said. "And he'd be right, but he's not here, and I am, and I'm doing the best I can with what happened." "That's all any of us can do," Tatius said. "Make the best of terrible beginnings and hope the middle and end are improvements." "That's very philosophical for a warrior king," Romulus observed. "Friendly? Warm. I've had time to think," Tatius replied. "Getting older gives you perspective. Getting forced into joint kingship with someone who kidnapped your people's daughters gives you even more perspective." "I'm very educational that way," Romulus said. Tatius laughed despite himself, despite everything, despite the fact that nothing about this situation should have been funny but somehow was anyway, because humour was how people survived circumstances too absurd to process through serious reflection alone. They continued their evening walk, 2 kings in one city, governing a people that was Roman and Sabine, and something new that didn't have a proper name yet but was building itself one family, one marriage, one generation at a time. Rome endured. Rome grew. Rome became something its founders hadn't planned for but would take credit for anyway, because that's what founders do, claim intention for accidents that worked out. And Romulus, walking through streets filled with people who existed because he'd made terrible choices, and women had made them work anyway, felt something close to peace. Not guilt-free peace. Not everything I did was justified peace. Just the peace of knowing that despite everything, despite all the costs and crimes and catastrophic decisions, he'd built something that would continue after he was gone, something that mattered, something that lasted, something that was worth gentle. Well, not worth Remus. Nothing was worth that, but worth continuing, Worth improving. Worth hoping that future generations would do better with Rome than he had. That would have to be enough. And most days it was. "5 years passed. 5 years of joint rule, of Rome becoming something neither wholly Roman nor wholly Sabine, but functioning nonetheless through determined pragmatism and the discovery that cooperation was less exhausting than constant conflict. 5 years that felt long when you were living them day by day, and impossibly short when you looked back and realized how much had changed. Gentle, the city had doubled in size. New buildings crowded the hills, pressing against the expanded walls that now enclosed not just the Palatine but the Capitoline, the Quirinal, spaces that had been separate and were now just neighborhoods in something larger. The population had grown through births and immigration. People still arrived seeking asylum, though now they found a city more complex than the desperate refuge Rome had been when the asylum was first established. Romulus was 28 now, which felt old when he remembered being 23 and thinking he understood kingship. Tatius was in his mid-50s, greying further, moving with the careful deliberation of someone whose body had started negotiating terms about what it would and wouldn't do anymore. They'd settled into partnership with the comfortable efficiency of people who'd learned each other's rhythms, who could predict disagreements and navigate them without drama. It worked, this arrangement. Imperfectly, awkwardly, but it worked. Rome functioned. Trade flourished. Children grew. The integration that had seemed impossible 5 years ago had become normal. Mixed families, merged traditions, a population that was starting to forget there had ever been a time when Roman and Sabine were separate peoples, rather than just different parts of the same complicated whole. Then Tatius made a decision that would remind everyone that peace was always more fragile than it appeared. It started with ambassadors from Laurentum, a Latin town south of Rome, one of the settlements that had maintained cautious friendship with the city despite Rome's reputation for doing terrible things, and then acting surprised when people objected. The ambassadors arrived with a complaint that should have been routine. Some of Tatius's relatives, Sabines who'd settled in Rome but maintained connections to their old families, had been travelling through Laurentine territory. They'd apparently decided that travelling through was an excellent opportunity for taking things that didn't belong to them. Gentle. The ambassadors were diplomatic about it. They didn't call it theft or robbery. They called it unfortunate misunderstandings about property ownership, and regrettable incidents involving resource redistribution. But translation: Tatius' kinsman had robbed Laurentine citizens, possibly killed some who'd resisted, and then fled back to Rome expecting family connections to protect them from consequences. The ambassadors asked for justice. They asked for the perpetrators to be handed over, tried, punished according to law. They asked Rome to demonstrate that being related to a king didn't grant immunity from basic standards of not stealing and murdering your neighbors. It was a reasonable request. More than reasonable, it was the minimum expectation of civilized relations between cities. Romulus heard the complaint, verified the evidence, and agreed that Tatius's relatives should absolutely face justice because that's how law worked, and Rome couldn't demand respect from neighbors while protecting criminals. Tatius disagreed. Not publicly at first. Not in front of the ambassadors or the joint senate, but in private, in the room where the two kings met to discuss sensitive matters away from witnesses. Tatius made his position clear. His kinsmen weren't going anywhere. They'd made mistakes, yes, but they were family. Sabine family. They'd fought in the war, integrated into Rome, contributed to the city. Handing them over to Laurentum would be betrayal. Gentle. It would be justice, Romulus corrected. They committed crimes. Crimes have consequences. That's how law works. Their family, Tatius repeated, as if this explained everything. You don't hand family over to enemies for punishment. You protect family. That's how loyalty works. Laurentum isn't our enemy, Romulus said carefully. They're allies. Or they were, until your relatives decided robbery was an acceptable diplomatic strategy. And protecting criminals because they're related to you isn't loyalty, it's corruption. Tatius's face hardened. Don't lecture me about corruption. You built this city through asylum for criminals. You filled Rome with fugitives and murderers and people fleeing justice in their hometowns. Now you want to play moral authority over a few Sabines who made mistakes? Yes, Romulus said flatly. Because there's a difference between granting asylum to people seeking fresh starts and protecting people who commit crimes while representing Rome. Your relatives weren't fleeing persecution, they were actively creating it. Dindle generally is the same. They argued for hours, positions hardening, neither willing to yield. It was the worst fight they'd had in 5 years of joint rule, the kind of argument that revealed the foundations were less stable than the structure suggested. By the end, Tatius had made his decision clear. His kinsmen would not be surrendered. He would protect them. Rome could either support him or not, but he wasn't changing his position. Romulus, against every instinct telling him this was catastrophically bad judgment, let it go. Not because he agreed, he absolutely didn't agree, but because forcing the issue would fracture the joint kingship, possibly split Rome along ethnic lines again, definitely restart tensions that had taken 5 years to calm. So he let Tatius make the wrong choice, and Rome made the wrong choice with him, and the Laurentine ambassadors returned home empty-handed and furious. Consequences came slowly, the way consequences do when you've made diplomatic mistakes but everyone's being polite about giving you time to reconsider. Laurentum sent more messages, more ambassadors, increasingly less diplomatic requests for Rome to honour its legal obligations and international agreements. Each time, Tatius refused. Each time the gap between what Rome should do and what it was actually doing grew wider. Gentle, soft. Then Tatius made an even worse decision. He decided to go to Lavinium personally, not to negotiate, not to make peace. He was going to make a sacrifice at a sacred festival to demonstrate Sabine piety and Rome's respect for religious tradition. It was supposed to be a gesture of goodwill, a way to maintain relationships despite the unresolved justice issue. It was political theatre that ignored the basic reality that Laurentum and Lavinium were allied, and people who'd been denied justice tended to hold grudges, and travelling to their territory while still protecting the criminals they wanted punished was the kind of decision that made everyone except Tatius recognise as obviously dangerous. Romulus tried to stop him. "This is stupid," he said bluntly, during another private meeting where diplomatic language had been abandoned in favour of honest assessment. "You're going into territory where people want you dead to perform a religious ceremony that can be performed anywhere, while refusing to address the grievance that made them want you dead in the first place. How does this end well?" "It ends with Rome maintaining its religious obligations," Tatius said stubbornly. "And with me demonstrating that I'm not afraid of threats from people who prioritise vengeance over piety." "Being unafraid and being stupid aren't the same thing," Romulus observed. "But I assume you've already decided, and my attempts to inject common sense into your planning are just ritual gestures we're performing before you do the dangerous thing anyway." "Friendly. Warm. Correct," Tatius said. "At least bring guards," Romulus insisted. "Bring 50 men, bring 100. Bring enough that threatening you becomes complicated for anyone considering it." "I'm going to perform a sacrifice," Tatius replied. "Not invade. A large military presence would insult my hosts and suggest I don't trust their hospitality." "You shouldn't trust their hospitality," Romulus said. "Their hospitality is currently competing with their desire for justice, and I don't think hospitality is winning." But Tatius went anyway, because he was a stubborn 55-year-old king who'd spent decades making decisions and wasn't about to start taking advice from someone half his age, just because that someone half his age was technically his co-ruler, and occasionally had good points about personal safety. He took a small retinue, 10 men, barely enough to be ceremonial guards, definitely not enough to actually guard anything. They travelled south to Lavinium, were received with the formal politeness that preceded violence, and began preparations for the sacrifice at the sacred grove outside the city. What happened next was disputed by everyone who wasn't there, and unobserved by everyone who was, because the only witnesses were either participants or corpses. The official story was that a riot broke out during the festival, completely spontaneous. Nothing to do with the unresolved justice issue, or the fact that Tatius had protected criminals who'd victimized Laurentine citizens. Just unfortunate timing when emotions happened to run high during a religious ceremony. The unofficial story, the one that circulated through Rome in whispers and reached Romulus through multiple contradictory reports, was that people from Laurentum had been waiting. They'd known Tatius was coming, they'd planned this, and when the sacrifice began, when Tatius was at the altar with his back to the crowd and his attention on religious observance, they moved. Tatius died at the altar, stabbed, struck, killed by a crowd that might have been a mob, or might have been assassins pretending to be a mob. His guards tried to defend him but were outnumbered, overwhelmed. Some were killed, some escaped to bring word back to Rome. None had been able to save the king who'd made the spectacularly poor decision to put himself within reach of people who wanted him dead. Word reached Rome 3 days later. A messenger arrived at dawn, exhausted from hard riding, bearing news that Romulus had been half expecting since Tatius left. The Sabine king was dead, killed at Lavinium. Riots, the messenger said. Uncontrollable violence. Regrettable accident. Gentle. Accident, Romulus repeated flatly. That's what they're calling it, Lord, the messenger confirmed. Romulus dismissed him and sat alone for a while, processing what had happened and what it meant. Tatius was dead, his co-ruler, his partner in the bizarre experiment of joint kingship, the man who'd been his enemy, and then his colleague, and occasionally his friend, gone, killed in circumstances that were definitely not accidental regardless of what official statements claimed. Rome needed a response. The question was what kind. Vengeance would be expected. Tatius's family, the Sabine population, everyone would expect Romulus to retaliate against Lavinium for killing a Roman king. That was how these situations were supposed to work. Kings who died violently got avenged. It was tradition. But Romulus, sitting alone in his palace with the weight of another bad decision about to be made, thought about what Tatius had died for. He'd died protecting criminals. He'd died because he'd put family loyalty above justice, political face-saving above diplomatic sense, stubborn pride above personal safety. And vengeance would just continue the cycle. More violence, more deaths, more grievances that would fester until the next explosion. Gentle, soft. He called a meeting of the Senate. All of them, Roman senators and Sabine senators. The whole complicated structure they'd built to accommodate merged governance. They gathered expecting him to call for war, to rally them for revenge, to make Lavinium pay for killing Rome's king. Instead, Romulus told them the truth. Tatius died because he made bad decisions, Romulus said, his voice carrying across the silent chamber. He protected criminals who victimized our allies. He refused reasonable requests for justice. He traveled into hostile territory despite warnings, and he died because people he'd wronged took the opportunity his poor judgment gave them. The Sabine senators looked outraged. The Roman senators looked confused about whether they were supposed to be outraged or relieved. Romulus continued before anyone could interrupt. We can avenge him. We can march on Lavinium, demand retribution, start a war that will kill more Romans and more Latins, and accomplish nothing except proving that we're willing to die for a man who died because he was wrong. Or, he paused, we can honor Tatius by learning from his mistakes. We can reaffirm our alliance with Lavinium, acknowledge that justice wasn't served when it should have been, and demonstrate that Rome is capable of choosing peace over vengeance when vengeance would just create more problems. Gentle, you're saying we do nothing? One of the Sabine senators demanded. A king was murdered and we just accept it? I'm saying we acknowledge that Tatius created the conditions for his own death, Romulus replied, and that continuing his policies would just create conditions for more deaths. I'm saying we choose to be better than what killed him. It was the hardest argument Romulus had ever made to a Senate that didn't want to hear it. But he made it anyway, through hours of debate, through Sabine anger and Roman uncertainty, through all the complicated emotions that came from trying to honor a dead king by admitting his final decisions were catastrophically wrong. Eventually, grudgingly, the Senate agreed. There would be no vengeance. Rome would reaffirm its alliance with Lavinium. The criminals Tatius had protected would be quietly exiled, not surrendered to Laurentine justice, but removed from Rome, a compromise that satisfied nobody but prevented war. Gentle Tatius was buried with honor. Full ceremony, speeches about his contributions to Rome, recognition of his role in creating the peace that had held for 5 years. The speeches didn't mention that he'd died stupidly, because speaking ill of the dead was impolite, but everyone knew, and knowing meant learning, which was more valuable than vengeance. After the funeral, after the ceremonies, after Rome had processed the death of a king, and decided not to destroy itself over it, Romulus stood alone at Tatius's grave and spoke to the silence. You were stubborn, he said, wrong about family loyalty versus justice, wrong about personal safety versus political gestures, wrong about a lot of things at the end, but, he paused, you helped build this. You made the joint kingship work. You helped integrate peoples who should have stayed enemies. You were a good king most of the time, even if you were a terrible king at the very end. The grave offered no response, which was its fundamental limitation. Gentle, soft Romulus left, returning to a city that was now his alone to rule. No co-king, no partner to share blame and credit, just him, sole ruler of Rome again, carrying the weight of decisions without anyone to argue with about whether they were right. It felt familiar. Lonely, but familiar. Like returning to something he'd been before. Except now he was older, and Rome was larger, and the consequences of bad decisions had become much more clear. He'd rule well. He'd learn from Tatius's mistakes. He'd choose justice over loyalty when they conflicted. Peace over vengeance when vengeance was just pride in disguise. That's what Tatius's death had taught him. It was an expensive lesson. But Rome had always been expensive. And Romulus was learning to pay the costs without pretending they weren't terrible. "20 years passed. 20 years of sole rule after Tatius's death, of Rome growing from ambitious experiment to something that resembled permanence. 20 years that transformed Romulus from a young king who'd killed his brother over walls into a middle-aged ruler who'd learned that building cities required more than walls, and that maintaining them required more than just refusing to die. Gentle. He was 48 now, which was old by the standards of people who'd spent their lives fighting and building and making decisions that aged them faster than time alone could manage. His hair had grey in it, though not as much as it should have given everything he'd lived through. His body still worked, mostly though mornings required more negotiation with joints about their willingness to cooperate. He moved with the careful efficiency of someone who'd learned to conserve energy because energy was a finite resource and kingship required more of it than seemed fair. Rome had become something neither he nor Remus could have imagined that day they'd stood on separate hills counting birds and arguing about divine favour. The city now covered all 7 hills: Palatine, Capitoline, Quirinal, Aventine, Caelian, Esquiline, Viminal, each with its own neighbourhoods, temples, character. The walls enclosed perhaps 30,000 people, maybe more if you counted generously, and included the settlements just outside that were functionally Roman, even if technically independent. It was the largest city in Latium now, possibly the largest in all Italy, though the Greeks in the south might have disputed that claim with the annoying confidence of people who'd been civilized longer and thought that mattered more than current population statistics. Rome had markets that attracted traders from distant cities. It had temples that rivaled anything in neighbouring lands. It had laws, governance, infrastructure that mostly worked, and a reputation that had evolved from city of criminals to city you probably shouldn't attack unless you enjoyed losing. Romulus had ruled alone since Tatius died, and the city had functioned without joint kingship through the discovery that one decisive king was often more efficient than 2 kings who had to negotiate everything. He'd maintained the Senate, the tribal structure, the integrated governance that merged Roman and Sabine traditions. He'd expanded the asylum, welcoming more refugees, more criminals seeking fresh starts, more people fleeing circumstances that had become unbearable. Rome still specialized in taking broken things and making them functional, which remained its defining characteristic and occasional problem. Gentle. He'd built temples. So many temples. Jupiter Feretrius still housed the spolia opima from his duel with Acron. Jupiter Stator commemorated the battle where his line had held against the Sabines. He'd added temples to Quirinus, to Janus, to various gods who'd helped or at least hadn't actively interfered. Rome was becoming properly religious, which priests appreciated even if Romulus suspected the gods cared less about temples than about whether cities murdered their own people for stupid reasons. He'd also built Rome's first prison, the Tullianum, an underground chamber carved into the Capitoline hill, where serious criminals could be held before execution or exile. It was dark, damp, and thoroughly unpleasant, which was the entire point. One visiting diplomat had called it inhumane, and Romulus had replied that it was specifically designed for humans who'd done inhumane things, which made it appropriately human in a circular logic way that the diplomat had found unsatisfying but couldn't effectively argue against. His legacy was complicated. He'd founded Rome, which was an achievement that would echo through centuries. He'd also killed his brother, kidnapped women, started wars, made catastrophically bad decisions that had somehow resulted in functional outcomes through luck and the competence of people around him who'd fixed what he'd broken. History, he suspected, would argue about whether he was a great king or a terrible person who'd been useful, and the answer was probably both depending on which aspects you emphasized. Hersilia was still alive, still sharp-tongued, still reminding him periodically that Rome existed despite him as much as because of him. She'd become one of his informal advisors, the person he consulted when he needed honest assessment rather than political theatre. Her husband Hostus had died 5 years prior, and she'd mourned appropriately but not excessively, which suggested their marriage had been respectful but not passionate, which, she'd pointed out once, was better than most marriages and definitely better than starting with kidnapping. "You're getting old," she told him one afternoon when he'd summoned her to discuss a property dispute that was threatening to become a clan feud. They were in his palace, which was actually palatial now, with multiple rooms and structural integrity and everything, reviewing documents and eating bread that Clelia had made before she died 2 years ago. taking Rome's culinary standards with her to whatever afterlife rewarded people who'd spent their lives fighting Roman cooking incompetence. "Gentle, I'm 48, Romulus said. "That's not old." "It's old for a king who spent his life fighting and making enemies," Hasilia corrected. "Most kings don't make it to 48. They die dramatically in their 30s or 40s, usually through violence or hubris or both." "Friendly, warm." "I'm very careful," Romulus protested. "You killed your brother over a wall," Hasilia reminded him. "That's not careful. That's the opposite of careful. You've survived through luck and the fact that people who wanted you dead were slightly less competent than you were." "That's fair," Romulus admitted, "but I'm still alive, so clearly my strategy is working." "Your strategy is being too stubborn to die conveniently," Hasilia said, "which has worked so far but isn't sustainable forever. You should think about succession, about what happens when you're actually gone instead of just theoretically mortal." "I don't have children," Romulus pointed out. "I never married, never produced heirs, which is either very stupid or very intentional depending on whether you think Rome needs hereditary monarchy or something more flexible." "Gentle. It's very stupid," Hasilia said bluntly, "but also maybe smart if it prevents civil war over succession. Rome will figure out what comes next. We always do, usually badly, but we figure it out." "That's not reassuring," Romulus observed. "It's realistic," Hasilia corrected, "which is better than reassuring. Reassurance is what you offer people who need comfort. Realism is what you offer people who need to make actual plans." They finished their meeting, resolved the property dispute by basically telling both clans to split the difference and stop being dramatic, and Hasilia left with her usual parting comment about how Rome would probably be fine after he died, but she wouldn't bet money on it. That conversation stayed with Romulus, settling into his thoughts the way uncomfortable truths do when you can't ignore them through distraction. He was old, maybe not old, but old enough that assuming he had decades left was optimistic. And Rome did need to think about succession, about what came after the founding king died, about whether the next king should be chosen by Senate, or elected by people, or determined through trial by combat like some kind of chaotic game show. He was thinking about this, about succession and mortality, and whether he'd accomplished enough to justify all the terrible things he'd done to accomplish it when the storm came. Gentle. It arrived without warning on a summer day that had been clear and hot. Romulus was at the Campus Martius, the field of Mars, outside the city walls reviewing troops with the Senate. It was routine, annual, the kind of military inspection that demonstrated Rome still had soldiers and those soldiers still remembered which end of a spear was dangerous. The Senate attended because watching military reviews was part of their responsibilities, and because it got them out of their usual meeting chamber where they normally argued about grain distribution and whether certain neighborhoods should be allowed to keep roosters. The storm came suddenly, violently, with the kind of dramatic entrance that suggested either divine intervention or just weather being theatrical. Dark clouds appeared from nowhere, covering the sun, turning noon into twilight. Thunder rolled across the field, loud enough that some of the soldiers dropped their weapons and looked skyward like they were expecting judgment or at least an explanation. Then the wind hit. Not the normal wind that moved air around, but wind that felt personal, targeted, like someone had decided this specific patch of ground needed to experience what hurricane force meant. It scattered the Senate, sent soldiers running for cover, turned the organized military review into chaos where everyone's primary goal was not being blown away by meteorologically improbable gusts. Romulus stood in the center of it. Not running, not fleeing, just standing there like someone who'd decided that if the gods were making dramatic gestures, he might as well face them directly instead of hiding like this was survivable through architectural intervention. The wind whipped around him. Rain came. Not falling, but arriving horizontally, hitting with the force of divine displeasure. Lightning struck close enough that the thunder was immediate, simultaneous, the kind of sound that made your bones vibrate. And then, gentle. Well, and then what happened depended on who you asked, and how much they'd been drinking when they told the story. Some people said Romulus disappeared into the storm, just vanished, taken by the wind, ascending to heaven because he was the son of Mars, and Mars had decided to reclaim him. They said he'd been transformed, deified, made into a god, the god Quirinus, protector of Rome, still watching over the city he'd founded even after death stopped him from ruling it directly. Other people said the storm was cover for assassination. That senators who'd grown tired of Romulus's 40-year rule had used the chaos to kill him, dismember his body, hide the evidence, and then claim divine ascension because we murdered the king was harder to explain than the gods took him. This version was whispered, never stated publicly, but it circulated through Rome with the persistence of conspiracies that might be true or might just be what people wanted to believe because it was more interesting than weather accidents. A few people claimed Romulus had simply walked away, used the storm as excuse, as cover, as opportunity to abandon kingship and become someone else. That he'd been tired, done with ruling, ready for whatever came next that wasn't being responsible for 30,000 people's survival and happiness. That he'd faked his own divine ascension like it was some elaborate exit strategy that let him retire with dignity, instead of admitting he wanted to stop being king and maybe work on his pottery skills or whatever ex-kings did when they quit. The truth. The actual truth that nobody would ever know for certain because the only person who knew was either dead or a god or living anonymously in some distant city making pottery, was probably simpler than any version. The storm came. Romulus stood in it, and when the storm passed, he was gone. Maybe the gods took him. Maybe the senators killed him. Maybe he just left. Maybe he died of something mundane like a heart attack or a stroke, and everyone decided divine ascension sounded better than the king's body stopped working in a field during a storm. What mattered wasn't how he left, but what he left behind. Rome endured. That was the important part. The city he'd founded kept existing after he was gone, which meant it was real, permanent, more than just one man's ambition held together by walls and determination. The Senate chose a new king, Numa Pompilius, a Sabine, who was supposedly wise and peaceful, and everything Romulus hadn't been, which seemed like intentional contrast but probably worked as strategy. Temples were built to Romulus's Quirinus. Prayers were offered, festivals were established. He was deified officially, which meant he'd become a god whether he'd wanted to or not, whether it was true or just politically convenient for Rome to claim its founder had divine status. People swore oaths by Quirinus. People prayed to him for protection. People told stories about how he'd been taken by the gods because he was too great for mortal death. Gentle. And maybe that was true. Maybe Mars had reclaimed his son. Maybe Romulus was somewhere in whatever afterlife gods provided for their semi-divine offspring, watching Rome continue, occasionally checking in on the city like a parent whose children had grown up and didn't need constant supervision anymore but was still worth monitoring to make sure they weren't making completely catastrophic decisions. Or maybe he was just dead. Killed by weather or senators, or his own body deciding 48 years was enough, and it was time to stop. Maybe there was no divine ascension, no transformation into Quirinus, just a king who'd lived and ruled and then stopped doing both because that's what mortality means. But Rome believed the divine version. Rome needed the divine version, and whether it was true mattered less than what believing it accomplished. A city that could claim divine founding, divine protection, divine destiny that would carry it through whatever came next. Achates, who'd survived Romulus by surviving everything, told the story to anyone who'd listen. He'd been there when the storm came. He'd seen Romulus disappear. He swore it was divine ascension, genuine transformation, the gods taking their son home. Whether Achates actually believed it or whether he was a good friend telling the story his dead king would have wanted told was unclear and ultimately irrelevant. The story became truth through repetition, through belief, through Rome deciding this was how their founder's story ended. Gentle. At Remus's grave, still maintained, still honoured despite everything. Someone had placed flowers. Fresh flowers, like someone was still visiting, still remembering. Whether it was family or strangers, or Romulus himself before he disappeared, nobody knew. But the flowers kept appearing for years afterward, like the city hadn't forgotten that Rome began with 2 brothers, and only one survived, and that survival came with costs that were still being paid generations later. The she-wolf statue that had been erected near the Lupercal cave, commemorating the beginning of everything, the impossible rescue that started the whole chain of events, stood silent and permanent, bronze, weathered, worn by time but enduring. Children played around it, parents told the story, how 2 brothers had been saved by a wolf, raised by a shepherd, gone on to found the city that would become the center of the world. The story usually ended with Romulus becoming a god. The story rarely mentioned Remus except as tragedy, as the brother who died so Rome could live. History, it seemed, preferred simple narratives about divine founders over complicated truths about fratricide and guilt, and the costs of building empires. But Rome remembered both brothers. In temples and stories, in festivals and prayers, in the complicated mythology that was forming around the city's origins. Romulus the founder, the god, the king who'd built something from nothing, and Remus the martyr, the tragic figure, the one who had to die so the story could continue. Gentle, soft, both were necessary. Both were true, both were Rome. Somewhere in heaven, or the afterlife, or just memory. Maybe the brothers had reconciled. Maybe divine transformation or death or whatever had happened had given them perspective on why the walls mattered and why they didn't, why Rome was worth building and worth the cost, and also worth questioning forever, whether the cost was justified. Or maybe they were still arguing, still debating divine signs and authority and whether 6 vultures or 12 mattered more, still being brothers in whatever way brothers exist after mortality stops being relevant. Either way, Rome continued. That was what mattered. The city they'd founded, one through action, one through absence, grew into something neither could have imagined, an empire eventually, a civilization, a story that would be told and retold for thousands of years until the names Romulus and Remus became synonymous with founding and sacrifice and the terrible beautiful mess of building something from nothing. The walls still stood. The city still grew. The people still lived and fought and loved and died and raised children who would do the same. Rome endured. That's what the brothers had built. That's what their story meant. That's what all the walls and blood and terrible decisions had purchased. Continuation, permanence, something that would outlast the people who built it. And in the end, after everything, after all the costs and crimes and catastrophic choices, maybe that was enough. Maybe that was all anyone could hope for. To build something that lasted. To matter. To be remembered. Even if remembering was complicated. Even if the story was messy. Even if the truth was somewhere between myth and history, and nobody would ever fully agree on which parts were which. Gentle, Rome remembered. And in remembering, kept building, kept growing, kept becoming whatever it would become next. The rest was just details for historians to argue about, while Rome continued doing what it had always done. Surviving, enduring, refusing to stop existing just because one king or 2 brothers or 1,000 complications suggested it shouldn't. That was Rome. That would always be Rome. And Romulus, wherever he was, god or ghost or dust, could rest knowing he'd accomplished what he'd set out to do. He'd built something that lasted. Even if lasting came at costs, nobody should have to pay. Even if the story was darker than legends suggested. Even if success and terrible decisions were so thoroughly mixed together that separating them was impossible. He'd built Rome, and Rome would build itself from there. One generation after another, one decision after another, one wall and one story and one complicated legacy at a time. Forever. Thank you for spending these hours with Romulus and the founding of Rome. If you enjoyed this journey through ancient history, please subscribe for new episodes weekly. We're building Rome's story king by king, from mythological founding through republic and empire. Rate and review if you're inclined. It helps others discover these stories. Share with anyone who loves history or needs something substantial for sleep or study. Until next time, rest well. Rome continues. The story continues. See you soon.